before I get into a couple of words I've prepared, I just want to say it's great to see everyone here today in this amazing venue. And I was reflecting on the sessions this morning, and it's really interesting to see how the conversation has changed in the last 10 years even, on what we're focusing on and how we manage our marine space. So in this session, we're going to talk about what approaches to decision-making are needed to balance the need for social and economic benefit alongside environmental recovery, delivering a sustainable blue economy. And I'm going to take the liberty as chair to put one slide up. Those of you who know me and know my amazing team at HMC, we do lots of work on policy and governance and delivery in the UK, but we also work overseas. So this is a piece of work we've been developing with the UN Environment Programme and Portsmouth University, helping them to define what a sustainable blue economy is. And this is their vision up there that I'm not going to repeat. But effectively, what we've been working with them is to say that a sustainable blue economy is about having 100% well-managed, healthy ocean. That's about protecting and developing our blue resources like livelihoods, tourism, infrastructure, thriving marine life, community resilience, and all of that considering climate change. And underpinning that, they've developed these 5 principles about protecting, most importantly, restoring and regenerating our healthy ecosystems. Oh, wait there. Sustainable consumption and production, climate stability and resilience, equitability and inclusivity is important in the UK. It's even more important in the developing world. And lastly, about applying circular economy approaches. So it's just to say the questions we're going to talk about today are not just applicable to the UK. We are talking about them on a global scale, and they're fundamental to how we deliver a blue economy that is sustainable, protects and restores the environment, increases social benefit, but also drives economic growth, because that is important as well. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today, ranging from the Crown Estate to the port sector, to the renewable sector, to the NGO sector and government. So hopefully we're going to get some great presentations and some good debate. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Michelle Moore from the Crown Estate to come up.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I think I'm actually suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome today with following the great kind of level and lineup of speakers that have been before me, and actually just on the theme of inclusivity. I was listening to a podcast recently which said that I think it's 2/3 of women actually experience imposter syndrome, and I think it's about half of men. So I think what I'll take from that is I'm in good company. So I will get started. In terms of, I'll be just kicking off this last set of presentations today, and I'm here to talk to you today about the work that we're doing through our Whole of Seabed programme to help deliver a sustainable blue economy. So in terms of what I'll be covering today, I will just briefly talk a little bit about the Crown Estate and who we are, for anyone that isn't aware, and I'll then focus on the Whole of Seabed approach. I'll touch briefly on delivery route map, and then cover next steps in relation to Whole of Seabed. And I've been told very strict times of 10 minutes, so I'll be having a little sign up saying there's 1 minute left. So a brief introduction to the Crown Estate for anyone that isn't aware. The Crown Estate is a really unique business with a very diverse portfolio of property and assets that are stretching across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's both onshore and the seabed. So we were established through an Act of Parliament, which means that we're tasked with generating profit from that land, which is then returned to the UK Treasury for the benefit of the nation's finances. And what we've returned has totaled £3 billion over the last 10 years. We're one of the UK's largest landowners, and we have a responsibility to unlock value for the nation and nature, so through enabling green energy, driving economic growth and jobs, and creating and protecting thriving biodiversity and marine natural environments. So it's very much about actively managing the land and seabed to make a really meaningful difference, and ultimately creating lasting and shared prosperity for the nation, which is our driving purpose. So we manage the seabed and half the coastline around England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and play a really vital role in delivering long-term value for the nation, so enabling delivery of multiple priorities, including net zero and nature recovery. And we enable the sustainable development of critical sectors such as the UK's offshore wind industry, as well as helping to facilitate the development of sectors such as offshore telecoms cables, so we can all get our internet, pipelines and carbon capture, utilisation and storage under the seabed. And we also manage the extraction of marine minerals from the seabed to support the construction industry and also encourage the creation of habitats, putting the recovery of nature at the heart of what we do. So there's a whole host of activities that we lease, license or manage, and our aim is really to unlock the potential of our seabed to support the nation's transition to a more resilient, sustainable and decarbonised future. I think it's not going to be lost on this room that demand for marine space that supports many jobs, livelihoods and important natural habitats and wildlife is growing rapidly, and the UK faces increasing challenging decisions on how to use the seabed. So with our deep expertise and experience in spatial analysis and the digital tools that underpin it, will be vital to unlocking some of the challenges that we face and the scale of change that's needed across the marine environment over the next 30 years. So we've invested in marine data and evidence quite significantly and spatial planning tools and capabilities for over 20 years now so that we can gain a really deep understanding of our marine resources. Spatial planning for us, alongside stakeholder engagement, is really central to ensuring that development of the seabed occurs in a really considered and sustainable way. And most recently, that spatial planning capability has seen the creation of a pioneering whole of seabed programme, which aims to look holistically at competing demands on our space. So, what is the whole of seabed approach? Well, it's very much about building the spatial evidence base to support our holistic understanding of the seabed. And we do this through a consideration of demand across multiple sectors within the marine space and detailed spatial analysis to identify and digitally map the marine areas required to meet that demand. We then develop a range of scenarios out to 2050, which can demonstrate the various different ways in which the seabed could develop and what that might mean in terms of the activities and livelihoods that depend upon the space. So there are 6 priority sectors that we focused on in phase 1 of the work, which represent the Crown Estate sectors with the highest demand for seabed. So those were offshore wind, both fixed and floating, export energy cables, aggregate extraction, telecoms cables, CCUS, and nature. And we're currently in phase 2 of the programme, which will result in 10 sectors being included, and then longer term, further sectors will be added to the analysis as well. So in terms of our methodology within the whole of seabed programme, we start by taking a broad area of seabed through a process of spatial modelling and refinement that allows us to focus in on some prime areas of opportunity for different sectors. By using a unique set of digital tools, we can process and weigh up hundreds of spatial data sets, including information about wind speeds, seabed geology, etc., and cost, data related to other seabed users' interests and sensitivities, to create this really detailed understanding of a sector's resources. And this process allows us to identify prime areas of opportunity that are technically viable and optimise the cost, the location, but also the impact of development in more detail than ever before. So what we've done is we've attributed our prime areas of opportunity to a hexagonal grid in GIS and combined that with attributes from other data sets that essentially can characterise the seabed. So water depth, for example, or fisheries intensity data. And using this grid, we can then run multi-sector spatial scenarios out to 2050 that look at different objectives, such as maximising co-location of activities or focusing more on environmental benefits, for example. And we can then run these scenarios against a number of different demand profiles as well. So perhaps looking at maximum demand across sectors or a combination of different demand levels for each sector. And we're looking at delivering this in 5-year intervals out to 2050, so you can start to see how demand could be met over time. I should note here as well, the programme complements and informs existing work, including cross-government programmes such as DEFRA's Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme, which has been mentioned this morning, and the work that actually underpins whole of seabed is one and the same that's gone into that offshore wind modelling work in that Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme. So before I move on to some indicative scenario outputs, I just wanted to briefly take the opportunity to touch on the work that we've done so far to map prime areas for nature. So nature is at the very core of our ambition to become the most attractive and sustainable marine economy in the world. And therefore, its integration into the whole seabed programme and the elevation of nature as a sector has been really critical through this approach. So my colleagues, some of which are here today, have been working with a number of nature organisations to feed into the whole of seabed programme, and we're really grateful for this valuable input as it's resulted in a really comprehensive collation and integration of best available data that starts to represent the opportunity for nature. This includes the MPA network, but also, I'll just click on so you can see the map, but also beyond that as well, as we seek to both maintain nature where it's doing well based on evidence available and also give it the space it needs to recover. I think it's fair to say we recognise this is a continuously evolving picture, and we plan to build on this in the future to ensure a number of additional data sets are incorporated. So please do reach out to us if you'd like to be involved, or if you have any data that you think would be really valuable, please do come and speak to us. So on to scenarios. What you're seeing here is the current picture next to an indicative view of 2050 from one of the various scenarios that we've started to run. And these indicative outputs are really starting to allow us to understand the potential acceleration in demand for space out to 2050. Early figures are indicating that demand for marine space will increase tenfold in the coming decades, and with often long lead times for development, action is needed now to plan opportunities in a coherent and sustainable way. Other emerging insights from preliminary work include that there's multiple competition for that space, I'm sure we all know that, which will require some really critical decisions. But co-location is also an option for some sectors. We can't look at one sector alone in isolation. Nature absolutely needs to form part of that consideration. And lastly, we're starting to see some really tangible differences when we start to model different scenarios. So when we look at regional diversity, for example, in a scenario, you can really start to see how regional supply chains, port developments, and therefore regional jobs and social value for a particular area could increase. And not only will these scenario outputs start to drive the spatial design of the Crown Estate's longer-term seabed leasing processes and identify where knowledge gaps exist, it will also enhance coordination of future activities out to 2050 and beyond. And that brings me on to delivery route map, which I just wanted to touch on briefly. So we're partnering with a range of key government bodies and delivery agencies to clarify the national challenges that we jointly face. And the delivery route map work will utilise the whole of seabed evidence base to inform forward plans on leasing and licensing of the Crown Estate activity. But it will also drive collaboration on energy, nature, and other sector delivery plans to create future opportunities and coordinate action for net zero and nature recovery. So using whole of seabed as that common evidence base. And lastly, this is my last slide, I promise. Just to cover next steps, I'll be very quick. We're currently in phase 2 of the whole seabed programme, where we're adding a number of sectors to the analysis, and then from here we'll start to work more closely with partners to understand the wider activity demands within the marine space so that we can integrate this into the analysis. It's fair to say it's a complex challenge, and new information will continue to emerge and develop, as will the tools and processes that underpin our analysis. But the insights that I think we're going to gain from the evidence created through the whole of seabed programme will undoubtedly give confidence to decision makers, helping the UK on its journey to delivering a thriving marine environment and greatest value for the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Up next, we've got Benj Sykes from Ørsted, who's coming to talk to us about sustainability beyond carbon. Over to you, Benj.
Thanks, Dickon. Thanks. Good afternoon, and good afternoon to those of you who've joined us from home, or somewhere else at least. As Dickon said, I would really like to talk a little bit about what we do as a renewable energy developer and operator. But then maybe touch on some of the questions that are posed in the title of this session. And do excuse me, I have a bit of a frog, so I might need to stop for the odd drink. So who is Ørsted? Some of you may know us. We're the world's biggest offshore wind developer. We're quite big in the UK. We've got, depending how you count, about 12 wind farms in the UK. Offshore wind farms, I should say. We've got about 20 onshore as well now. We're the pioneers of offshore wind. We put our first offshore wind farm in Danish waters 33 years ago. So we've been doing this for a third of a century, believe it or not. People think offshore wind is new, and we've certainly got a lot to learn, but for sure, we have got some experience behind us. So we're very much a purpose-driven business. You can read the slide. We really are genuinely determined to address, obviously, the challenge of climate change, but as we do that, to tackle the challenge of biodiversity loss, and also to make sure that this is, to use a much abused and overused phrase, a just transition, to make sure that we do this in the right way. I'm not going to talk about the transition away from coal in the UK and how that worked out from a societal perspective, but I think you know the story. A little bit of flag waving, because I kind of have to, I suppose. I'll put my glasses on for this. We are quite proud that we have science-based targets signed off with the first energy company to do that. We will have scope 1 to 3 at net zero by 2040 and 1 and 2 next year, which is quite challenging. You can see 98% reduction in our carbon intensity by the end of next year. We can't quite get to absolute zero, so we will have to do a teeny bit of offsetting. We're also doing a lot around our impacts on nature, but going beyond that, those of you that work in offshore marine development will know you have to make sure you not only build what you're going to build, but address your environmental impacts. But we're trying to go further than that, and I'll come back to that. We also genuinely want to work out how to make this a just transition, how to make sure that the people we work with and the people we work around see the benefits of this transition to a cleaner, brighter future. It's got to be brighter as well as cleaner, and that means we can't just plough ahead. We need to take people with us. We are doing a lot on that. If I think, anyone here been to Grimsby? How many people here have been to Grimsby? Not many. I can recommend it. How many people say that? But seriously, Grimsby is a town that is being transformed by offshore renewables. We're just one operator there. We've got 500 people working in our operations base. Fantastic long-term, highly paid jobs compared to what was available in Grimsby before the industry arrived. We're also setting up a thing called a youth zone. Some of you may know that, to increase aspirations in the wider Grimsby community, doing a lot of other things as well, apprentices and so on. We're also linking it into environment in the Humber, and I'll come back to that. But the linkage between offshore development, environment, and society is very much a strong and interwoven one, as I hope I can demonstrate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is just a little bit of, well, it's a bit cartoonish, isn't it? The 5 areas where we focus on for our green energy projects, we like rather than renewable. And by the way, we do onshore wind, we do solar, we do storage. So there's lots of other technologies, which means lots of different types of environmental challenge that we face. But the biggest one by far is offshore. About 80% of our investment goes there. And actually, just as a little sidestep, if the UK is going to build 100 gigawatts of offshore wind, don't worry about the units. As you saw, the seas get very busy from that presentation. It's slightly scary. But on the flip side, 100 gigawatts represents around about £250 billion of investment. Just imagine if we can divert or channel some of that into social and environmental impact improvement. That's a lot of money to put to good use. So clearly any development in the marine space has an impact, but if we can do it in a way that harnesses the opportunities and deploy some of that £250 billion of capital in the right way, that's got to be a good thing. So yeah, we look at our supply chains. I've talked about that. We're very focused on labour rights, not so much in the UK. It's not a big issue, but certainly in solar PV. If you've tried to trace down the human rights story for your panels, that can be quite difficult. Come back to biodiversity and community. And we're also doing what we can on circular economy. A lot more work to do. We have stopped putting any of our used blades in landfills as one of a number of steps we've taken. Coming to biodiversity, we have set an ambition to make sure that every project we commission from 2030 has a net positive biodiversity impact. I had the privilege to go to COP15, I think it was, in Montreal, December before last. There are lots of people with nature positive by 2030 pin badges. And I put one on, and then after about an hour, I took it off. I thought, I've no idea what that actually looks like. So we've gone for the much less exciting and more of a mouthful, but perhaps something more tangible, is this ambition. And we're doing a lot of work in terms of testing out how we're going to do it in different settings. That's everything from supporting the growth of juvenile coral on the legs of turbines in the Strait of Taiwan, through to restoring the coastal ecosystem in the Humber through our Wilder Humber project. A lot of work to do also around measurement, because if you can't measure it, you can't prove it. If you can't prove it, your investors will probably cock an eyebrow and say, we don't believe you. So we want to be sure that as we do this, we work out how we can demonstrate that we've actually achieved it. And part of that is we're very proud we launched the first blue bond by any energy company, I think last year, maybe the year before, 100 million euros that we're investing into this biodiversity program. So we're serious about it. Taking action on environmental sustainability is important, and I'll come back to the word action, because talk is good, but action is better. We've done quite a lot of stuff. I'm not going to dwell on all of this, because in the interest of time, I think I should make sure I give the other speakers a go. A few things just to pick out. Some of that I've mentioned about our coral growing efforts in the Strait of Taiwan. We've put cod hotels. We do a lot of hotels. We've done cod hotels. We've done kittiwake hotels. We just hope the right species check in once they're aware of them. They are not on Airbnb, in case you're thinking of looking. We've also set out, as I say, a big measurement program, working with academics and others to make sure that it's not only Ørsted that figures out how to measure biodiversity in the marine environment, but actually it's something that the wider industry and the wider community working in this space can adopt. Just to touch briefly on the Wilder Humber project, that's a really exciting project we're doing together with the Lincolnshire and Yorkshire Wildlife Trusts. Putting in 500,000 native oysters in the Humber. They're all gone. You used to apparently be able to walk from the north to the south coast of the Humber just on oysters. Your feet will be a wreck, but you could actually do it. We're also planting a number of hectares of seagrass and doing some more shoreward restoration as well. I think that's really exciting, because it's not only environment, but it's also society, because we're bringing a lot of people in to experience that and see it. And that is energizing action on a wider basis than just our project. So I think I'm going to run out of time in about 2 minutes. You need a torch, Howell. I can barely see that. So what's needed? And I'm just going to flash these up, because I think we're going to unpack them a little bit later. So as I said, we need action. It's great to talk about. It's great to set targets, but we would really love other developers working in the marine environment to do the actual actions that are needed, and not just talk about it and set great and perhaps slightly waffly ambitions. We need really strong collaboration, and I mean, this panel is a good example. We've got industry, we've got NGOs and others. We need to collaborate. We need to have a common sense of purpose so that we can work through our differences. I'm very passionate about believing that we should see this as a win-win, horrible phrase, but I do believe it exists. I do think we should stop thinking this of this as a trade-off. We need more data. Who's ever going to argue with that? We need to take action now. It's a bit like the first one, but the longer we take, the harder it's going to be fixed. And prioritization is going to be needed, and so good luck to the Crown Estate and the Crown Estate Scotland figuring out how to prioritize the sea space. And we must be forward-looking. There's lots of things we wish we hadn't done as a society to the marine environment, but we need to look forward and solve this. Thank you.
Thanks, Benj. It's great to hear of all the amazing work that Ørsted are doing. Next up, we've got Geraint Evans from the UK Major Ports Group. Geraint.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everything's working here. Good afternoon. As we said, I was slightly. It's really interesting to hear some of the different views this afternoon. I joined the session in a fascinating area in many ways, but I thought I'd bring a perspective from the major ports group. So the major ports group is, as you should be able to see here. I hope you can see on the map. I'm the chief executive of the I would like to think the leading trade association that represents our major ports. So it's the 9 owning groups which you'll see there, the 40 major ports across the country, which represents, and depending on what day of the week it is about 77 or 78% of all volume that comes through our ports. So significant, but actually it's much more than about containers and shipping. As we've touched on with our colleagues at the Crown Estate and with Ørsted, there's many, many partnerships, and actually some of the more exciting areas are where we're really looking at offshore wind and new opportunities into gigafactories and that sort of thing. So a little bit about me as well. I joined the Major Ports Group this time last year, and I also worked in government for a long time as a sort of accidental special advisor in some ways, is that I led on what became the levelling up agenda. So I led on a lot of the regional economic development, which inevitably includes our coastal community. So it's been a long-held interest in mine, and really, really interesting. Also, interestingly, from a ports perspective, from my members, the 9 members, is that the ownership structure is absolutely global, pension funds, institutional investors, and the outlook and the view from the major ports is global, but very much local into some of the ports that some of them have owned for many, many, many years. So just a little bit on that. So I think that the key point that I think is critical in all of this, and I think it's made by other colleagues about the lack of a need for it being a trade-off, is that we need to get projects away. And having worked in economic development around the country for many, many years, there's 1,000 mislaid and plans that never quite make it off the drawing board. And what it's done to those communities is left those communities behind in many ways. And our ports, some of our ports in our communities are the biggest employers in those communities, and will go on to be even bigger as we focus on different areas. So I think we've got to find a way to move many of our exciting projects, be it in floating offshore wind, be it in some of the areas that are topical around hydrogen, methanol. You guys are all aware of the many, many things that are out there, but we've got to try and prioritize these things, and the port's at the center of this, and we're thinking very carefully as owning groups where we can really support those things, really. So the other point is, as the port sector is changing rapidly, which it is, and I'll come on to a couple of examples in a couple of slides' time, but it is, as lots of talk about electrification, but you think about a port is transformed in the last 5 or 10 years, is that we've gone from diesel-powered forklift trucks to in some cases, quite old-fashioned practices around manpower and womanpower on the quayside and all the rest of it. It's rapid, and I've noticed it in my visits around the country, is there's a huge amount of change. And I think that's a force for good, because I think it allows us to think about how we can actually drive the change in these communities. And in doing so, we're putting investment into places like Felixstowe, Southampton, and Port Talbot, and others, and I won't list them all, but I'll give you a couple of examples later on. But what that does do, that unlocks private investment, and it also unlocks public investment into supporting our environmental ambitions, and all of my members have got pretty clear ambitions on that as well. So my point being really is I think that plans aren't enough, and I think that you made that point as well. We've all been around long enough, and some of you will be earlier on in your career, but I've been you can tell by my grey hair, I've been around long enough to know that a plan is not enough. And what our ports are really keen to do is to find those things we can actually do. We're working with partners like the Crown Estate, working with developers and partners in these things, because unless you do that, then a lot of our benefits that we get from associated benefits from private investment working with public investment just doesn't happen. And I can point to a number of examples around the country where that could have happened. I think you referenced coal, and you could tell by my name, I'm from Wales originally. Coal left a lot of scars, not because of the problem itself, but how it was dealt with afterwards. And we'll see this in lots of the energy transition. I'll come on to that slightly later. The other quick point I would slightly make, and I'm mindful of time, is that this is really important. And our major ports, they very much see themselves as custodians in the community, often the largest employer, largest private sector employer, and very much custodians of the quay and of the seabed and all the rest of it. So I think there's an area there where in our nature ambitions, our environmental ambitions, we have to find a way to make sure that we take the public with us. And going back to my earlier point is that plans aren't enough. And many communities, and I can point to an example in every single region of the United Kingdom, where they thought it was going to happen. We thought it was going to be major private investment, thought it was going to be major public investment, and major benefits off the back of that from an environmental perspective. So it's absolutely essential, and we think very, very hard about that. So, as I've said, it's not enough to have plans, and we're very keen to work with partners, and I think it can provide good examples, and I'll think of one here, where we took a site, and some of you will know this site, over to the east of London, is that it was an old BP site, if I remember, I forget which one it was, but it was a site that was absolutely at risk of just being left for decades untouched. But big effort to decommission, big effort to clean up the site, and this has become one of the largest employers in the area, transformed the area, and a fourth berth will be opening later this year, which will effectively make it one of the, in a space of, I think, 10 or 12 years, take it to one of the largest ports in the country, and absolutely the jewel in the crown for DP World in terms of their global portfolio, which is no mean feat given what was there 10 years ago. So that's a very real example, a very practical example. The other one I wanted to just briefly touch upon, because it's topical, is I'm sure you all have seen the news around Tata at the steelworks in Port Talbot last week, and there's a big challenge there, and I know that site really well. I worked on the steel issues for many, many years, and no matter what comes next, we're going to see a reduction in the workforce, and we're going to see a reduction on space requirements for that steelwork. So therefore, there's going to be a big parcel of land that is going to need to be decommissioned, it's going to need to be cleaned up, and all the rest of it. Now, my fear, and this is my personal view, my fear is unless we can find a way to get major projects away, then that site could just be left, and we should go a little bit like the coal analogy that our colleagues pointed to earlier. What we need to do is to find a way to get these major projects, and this is one literally right next door to the steelworks, where the big floating offshore wind opportunity, which ABP, one of our key members, are developing. But this will do a number of things. A, it transforms the community of South Wales and Port Talbot. B, it allows and unlocks private money and public money to go into cleaning up the steelworks, which is absolutely critical. And C, we are grabbing the global opportunities in the global race that we're in to make sure we're taking the opportunities that come with floating offshore wind. So, economics moves in cycles, but we have to grab these opportunities. And my point is, plans aren't enough. If we miss this opportunity, my fear is not only do we miss a great opportunity to grab a big share of the floating offshore wind in the UK and all the associated benefits from that, but then the societal impact and the environmental impact for what will become a much smaller steelworks, we don't get that benefit at all. So I think there's an example where a major port has done a huge amount in the community, and I think this is a really topical and a great example. And I think that this is where the public sector, the private sector, and major institutional investors like the major ports can really take that forward. So, as I've said, just to summarize very briefly, and I'm mindful that the clock is ticking, we are pro-growth. We are pro-growth as a major ports group. We are pro-growth because we believe that growth brings absolutely associated environmental and the environmental and societal benefits in a sustainable way. And our record over the years across the 40 ports is very strong on that. More to do, of course, but we want to work with partners on that basis. But what we can't do is not prioritize, not deliver on plans, not deliver on rhetoric, not deliver on vague targets, I think, as we said earlier. And I think that's where my message to the audience is that work with the major ports, work with us, because we are keen to support and we're keen to get this stuff away. And, of the many of the opportunities that come forward in our economy in the future, we need to have a growing economy. No matter which government of the day comes in, which colour the government is later this year, they will want economic growth. They will seek economic growth, and that's absolutely essential. And it's only through the major ports and the ports of the UK we can deliver that. So I just want to leave you with that thought, and I would just thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Geraint. And I think that line, plans aren't enough, resonates with lots of us in this room. Our next speaker, I'd like to invite up Alyx Elliott from Oceana, UK. Alyx.
Thanks, Dickon, and good afternoon, everybody. I am from Oceana, one of the lead sponsors of the conference, and we're really delighted to be here with you today. If you haven't heard of Oceana, we are a global ocean conservation organisation. We're an NGO. I am a campaigner, so there's going to be a little bit of a change of tone in my presentation. And I have to say, I wasn't expecting this morning's keynote speaker to give me such a gift of talking about oil and gas in her opening sentences, so super grateful for that, and I'll certainly be addressing that as we go on in this presentation. Oil and gas campaigns, as I'm sure you all know, are usually synonymous with climate campaigning. Oceana is, of course, deeply concerned about the climate crisis and the climate impacts of oil and gas, which are well documented. But what I'm here today to talk to you about are those lesser known, lesser understood marine impacts of oil and gas, which are intertwined but also distinct from the climate crisis. Now, when you think about oil drilling and what impact it could have on the marine environment, oil spills are probably the first thing that springs to your mind. But as this graphic shows, there's far more to it than that. There's the release of toxic chemicals and microplastics as part of the drilling and development processes, including all sorts of different chemicals like mercury and PHAs that are toxic to marine life and that enter into the food chains, ultimately ending up in our stomachs if you eat fish. There are the pipes running along the seabed back to shore. There's the noise pollution at various different stages of production. There's the sewage and drains pouring into the sea from the rigs. And there's produced water, which I'll come on to shortly. First, those oil spills that you are all probably quite familiar with the concept of. Now, history has taught us these can be utterly devastating, not only for marine wildlife and habitats, but also for the people who live in coastal communities. Big or small, the cleanup from these events can take years, and the impacts felt for decades. We only have to look back at the Brer oil spill in 1993 to remember that after the tanker ran aground and spilled 85,000 tons of crude oil into the sea, at least 1,500 seabirds died. Elevated levels of PAHs were found in fish and shellfish, and there was oiling of sea otters and respiratory illnesses in grey seals. It also had major impacts on local fisheries, with fishing excluded from 400 miles of the spill and reported impacts on herring sporing and scallop fisheries. Perhaps less known about is chronic oiling from the produced water I mentioned a moment ago. Essentially, these are regular, often daily spills of smaller amounts of oil into the sea. I say smaller amounts of oil into the sea. The oil released from these spills has the same potential to kill seabirds and sea life and significantly impact the life chances and reproductive success of others. Our research with the climate campaigning group Uplift estimates that around 13,000 tons of oil has been released in this manner in UK seas in the last 5 years. And here's a glimpse of what's been happening. These images are from SkyTruth. They're an organisation that provides satellite imaging that help us to identify oil spills when they happen. On the left there is a map of Scotland, which shows the slicks in orange from 2023 alone. On the right is from 2 weeks ago, on the 9th of January, a 22 kilometres squared spill to the east of Scotland. That's an area equivalent to 3,500 football fields. That's why I say small oil spills. So what are the impacts on protected marine habitats and vital stores of blue carbon that we've been talking about today? The most obvious impact is where there's infrastructure built that destroys part or entire seabed habitats. This could be the rig itself, cabling, or pipelines. But habitat loss is not confined to the immediate footprint of development. It can extend at least 500 metres from the installation. This happens because construction and drilling create sedimentation, which can form thick layers on the surrounding seabed, and that can smother habitat-building sea creatures and lead to the complete loss or major degradation of habitats. Habitat loss also happens due to pollution. Oil pollution, for example, can lead to large-scale and long-term habitat loss, and drill cuttings and other chemical pollutants can impact habitat-building organisms like mussels, degrading the diverse habitats they create. Many types of habitat are at risk, including those habitats that host fish spawning grounds or contain vital stores of blue carbon. So how widespread is this problem? How worried should we be? So this is a map that shows oil developments in pink and how much they overlap with marine protected areas in purple. Our research last year that the latest round of oil and gas licenses, which were offered out, there were over 100 offered out, 40% overlapped with marine protected areas. These MPAs include a Dogger Bank, east of Gannet in a Montrose MPA, and of course the Faroe Shetland sponge belt, which will be heavily impacted by the vast Rosebank development that was approved at the end of last year. Now, Rosebank will emit the same annual emissions as the 28 least developed countries combined. The impacts don't end there, sadly. This here is a map of the seismic activity that happens during the exploration and drilling phases of oil production. Simply put, the darker the colour, the louder the sound. It's estimated that the sound produced during the seismic airgun surveys that take place as part of the exploration phase are 100,000 times louder than a jet engine. But why does this matter? Because of the damage it can do to marine mammals and fish populations. It's well documented, you're probably quite familiar, that cetaceans such as harbour porpoises, dolphins, orcas, humpbacks can have their hearing devastated by noise pollution, and this in turn can lead to displacement, disturbance and injury. Perhaps less known is that seismic activity has been shown to impact fish populations too. Fishers have reported lower catches following seismic surveys. For instance, a stress response was found in North Sea Atlantic cod, with impacts lasting for weeks. Studies have shown these impacts on many other commercially important fish, including haddock, blue whiting, saithe, and sand eel species. The specific impacts have included stress responses, behaviour change, permanent defects in fish larvae, reduction in the capacity of fish to breathe successfully, and the life expectancy of individual fish. That was a lot of doom and gloom. I do know that. So here's the good news. Times are definitely changing. Minds are definitely changing, and so are plans. At Oceana, we recently formed and launched the Ocean Alliance Against Offshore Drilling, a network of NGOs, businesses, academics, influencers, and everyday people, all united against new offshore drilling in UK seas and the protection of our marine environment. We only launched 2 months ago, but we already have around 50 member organisations, including Greenpeace, WDC, Blue Marine, plus businesses like Patagonia and Finisterre. The Alliance grows stronger every day, and this week is receiving the backing of several MPs across all political parties. Here's a snapshot of what we stand for. But what unites us all really is a knowledge of what the positive impacts would be of no new oil and gas for people, wildlife, and the environment. Ocean positive renewables are possible. Ocean positive energy is possible. Livelihoods and coastal economies do not need to suffer with a just transition. In fact, they would be boosted with investment in renewable energies that is located responsibly in areas that don't damage the marine environment. So many coastal communities and industries like fishing and tourism depend on. The marine environment does not need to suffer either, with correct placement and technology that minimises impact. 3/4 of the British public are against drilling in MPAs. And just to address one of the points from this morning, because I can't resist, oil and gas does not provide us with any energy security. On average, from discovery to production, it takes 28 years to get the oil. 28 years from now, from when new oil fields are discovered, that's when we get the oil from those fields. Additionally, the vast majority of the oil taken out of the UK seabed, is exported. It is not something that's going to help us here in the UK. We believe it does not need to be a choice between nature and the economy. We must do better, work harder to protect the climate, biodiversity, and economies without assuming one must suffer to benefit the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyx. Some really important messages there. That's really, it's something we need to remember when we're talking about what we're talking about. So thank you. Next up, we've got Annabelle Stockwin from DEFRA, who's going to talk to us about fisheries management. Annabelle.
How do I click it on? Hi, thanks everyone. Very much out of my comfort zone here, but not as much as if I've been sat up on the balcony, which does terrify me. Seem to have developed vertigo in my 40s, so thanks Coastal Futures for that being my opening line, nice and inclusive. Okay, so just... I'm Manvelsdorf-Defra. I'm the lead on shellfish policy in the non-quota species team. It's confusing to do this. Okay, so you'll recognise this slide. This is Jen's jigsaw from this morning. It's also my only pretty slide, so sorry about that. This is a bit of another dry DEFRA presentation. Okay. That's not that funny. Oh dear. So this is going to be a little bit of a form of an update. For those who attended last year, there was an introduction to fisheries management plans. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of progress that we've made. I'm going to be calling them FMPs from now on because that's much simpler. So what do FMPs do? In a nutshell, they do the following: defines the fishery and its geographical scope, makes an assessment of MSY, which is maximum sustainable yield. If that's not possible, sets out the evidence gaps that are needed and the policies and measures that we need in order to maintain the stocks at sustainable levels, and then how we're going to monitor the effectiveness of that plan. They also bring together everything that's currently known about the fishery. So just quickly as well on maximum sustainable yield, for a lot of the species that were chosen for FMPs are very data poor, so we don't even know what that might look like yet. So all the evidence that we're going to gather is just to reach the point where we at least understand where we ought to be. So I'll get to some of the management measures later, but just to talk a little bit about the precautionary approach. That basically means not enough evidence is not enough of a reason not to do anything. Okay, so there was a presentation last year, so I'll do a little bit of a recap for those who didn't commit that one to memory. The Fisheries Act sets in 2020 set out the objectives for achieving obtainable fishery, sustainable fisheries stocks. And then we followed with the Joint Fisheries Statement in 2022, which set out the policy on how we can actually deliver this, which is through 43 fisheries management plans. So we're trying to do a new collaborative way of delivering fisheries management. The theme today at this conference has been very much on collaboration, and we have developed the FMPs through a new collaborative approach, which means we can take a little bit more of a pragmatic view on how we should deliver this, and less of a top-down approach, so involving key stakeholders in the development of the plans from day one, rather than bringing everybody in right at the end and realising we've got it all wrong, which can be a bit of a tradition in government. So FMPs don't deliver everything on their own, but they're more than just a plan for a plan. They do contain measures that government is now committed, legally binding to deliver. Okay. So where we got to, we consulted on 6 FMPs over the summer, received over 500 responses. We went round the coast at least twice during that time, spoke to lots of stakeholders and lots of industry on the quayside. There's been quite a bit of talk today about how to involve stakeholders better and be a bit more inclusive in that way. We did try a new way of doing this. When we spoke to the industry, we used that as their consultation response, took all the details, so that they didn't give us all the information, and then we told them to go away and go online and fill in a 60-question survey as well. And that was quite effective, and we'll be doing more of that as we consult on these in the future. So the 6, what we call the front-runner FMPs,
Well, for whelk, crab and lobsters, king scallops, bass and channel demersal, non-quota. I won't read them all out, you can see them there. And southern North Sea and eastern channel mixed flatfish. We haven't published that one. That one's due to be published this year. Okay, implementation and next steps. Industry want us to move quickly as we can on this and effect some change. There's a range of mechanisms we're going to use to deliver these. The FMPs don't bring in new measures on their own, but they do commit us to measures, and then we'll need to use the traditional methods in order to bring those measures in. So working out whether we need a voluntary measure, a statutory instrument, license condition, or bylaw. So this is the key to the fisheries management plans is all about evidence gathering. As I mentioned, evidence gaps are identified. So everything we know about a species is in one place. What do we need to know in order to be able to make sure that we're fishing these sustainably? So the evidence gaps fall into key themes. There's the impact of the fisheries on the wider environment, climate change, how to better understand the specific stock, and also understanding the social and economic importance of the different species, and finally, what management measures and approaches are needed. We're going to be publishing a streamlined list of evidence gaps this year, and we're keen for all of you, the academic community, to support us in addressing these gaps. There is an evidence workshop planned very soon, I think, and that will continue with our collaborative way of working. We need to share knowledge and expertise so we can establish all the evidence priorities for these FMPs going forward. Okay. So the timeline for the delivery of the next FMPs, we've got cockles, sprat, skates and rays, or queen scallops, and flatfish all being published this year. Next year, we've got more coming down the track. So that's 6 down, 37 to go. So settle in. FMPs are going to be on the agenda for this type of conference for a while to come, I think. Okay, the delivery priorities for 2024. This is just a snapshot of some of the new measures you're going to be seeing that will come in this year. So just very quickly, banning soft-shell crab for bait, pilot scheme for crab and lobster. That's likely to focus on pot limits, harmonisation of scallop management across administrative borders, and development of a permit or entitlement scheme for whelk. Whelk is notably one of our most data-poor species, so first order of the day for a permit will be how are we going to gather more data. We're developing an action plan for cuttlefish and introducing measures of fly seining and effort for the 3 flatfish species. Cuttlefish is a really good example of a vulnerable but valuable species. They only live for a couple of years, makes them really hard to manage. This is a rolling process, an ongoing way of working that's going to be the way that we deliver fisheries policy in the future. Okay, 2 minutes. So going full circle again now. Jen would have spoken about this in her presentation this morning. I haven't got long, so I won't go through that again. I would just quite like to mention that there is work on climate change being carried out by some of the local inshore fisheries conservation authorities. We've talked about the impacts of climate change and looking forward. The fishing industry, I think they see stocks change and come and go, and sometimes new species come in and start to thrive in new areas. And we need to be responsive to that and make sure that the right management is in place. So that is all from me. We always want to hear from you. Here's all the details. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Annabelle. There's a lot to get through there. Next up, we've got Louise O'Hara-Murray from Scottish Government come to talk to us about the revision of the National Marine Plan.
Hello everyone, my name's Louise and I lead the wee but lovely team developing the new National Marine Plan for Scotland, originally titled the NNP2. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'd like to share with you how we are using a blue economy approach to developing the plan, the progress we've made so far, and how we'd like to work with you all in developing the plan. So we launched our blue economy vision in 2022. It's our vision in Scotland that sets our ambition for shared stewardship of our marine environment to support ecosystem health, improved livelihoods, economic prosperity, social inclusion, and well-being. It's an overarching vision that sets a bold new framing for the management of Scotland's marine environment out to 2045. And at its core, it recognises that economy and society are embedded in nature, they're not external to it. And it looks to take us beyond these traditional narratives of ocean production versus ocean protection, and rather recognises that we can achieve this sustainably together. There are 6 blue economy outcomes, they're on the slides. They set goals for natural capital, net zero, food security, thriving communities, and our economy. So we followed the blue economy vision with a delivery plan, which sets out commitments, including mainstreaming and a blue economy approach to our policy development in Scotland. And we will be doing this in NNP2. It will integrate the blue economy outcomes and it will deliver on the blue economy vision. Before we go any further, just a quick recap about planning in Scotland. It's devolved. Scottish ministers are the planning authorities for Scottish inshore and offshore waters out to 200 nautical miles. Our National Marine Plan provides the overall policy framework to guide decisions on how Scotland's marine space is used, and it supports our licensing and consent decisions. It also provides the framework for our sectoral and regional plans. So it's through sectoral planning in Scotland that we undertake spatially explicit planning for different marine sectors, which includes offshore wind. This does involve working with stakeholders and consulting with stakeholders before any leasing on where to site different offshore developments. And importantly, selecting the sites that have the least impact on other marine sectors. Our regional planning allows for more local ownership and for plans to reflect local circumstances. And my colleagues James and Danny, I can't see them, but they are in the audience, are going to be speaking tomorrow and sharing some insights on the Orkney regional plan. So, what does taking a blue economy approach to the new National Marine Plan actually mean in practice? Well, first of all, it's a new frame requiring us to think differently as planners, which means we need to consider the environment, the economy, and society all together. And we're doing this in all of the 3 main work packages to deliver the National Marine Plan 2. So in our assessments of the plan, in our policy development, in developing our monitoring and evaluation framework, and in our stakeholder engagement, which runs across all 3. So we have reflected our blue economy approach in the aims of the National Marine Plan 2. The National Marine Plan 2 will be furthering sustainable development in Scottish seas by developing a new planning framework that supports net zero, action on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and addressing biodiversity loss. This new plan will help to reduce the likelihood for conflict of marine space, and it aims to safeguard sustainable marine sectors, recognising the importance of marine sectors such as fishing to our local coastal communities. We've tried to reflect a blue economy in our structure for the plan. So the National Marine Plan 2 in Scotland will continue to support the UK's overarching vision for healthy and productive seas, which Jen shared earlier today. But it'll also be supporting our blue economy vision in Scotland. And we're doing this by setting a series of national level objectives that are for Scottish waters that deliver on our blue economy outcomes. And then these objectives will be delivered through Pacific area and sector-based policies underneath them. To operationalise this structure, improve usability of the plan, and cohesion in the policies. We are adopting a new area-based approach to the plan, which is very similar to the place-based approach which has been adopted in terrestrial planning in Scotland. And this allows us to better reflect the different contexts, the different sectors, and the different communities all around the coast of Scotland. We're adopting a blue economy approach to our assessments, so it's providing the frame for our sustainability appraisal. We are conducting a strategic environmental assessment, habitats regulation appraisal, and a social economic impact assessment, so that we can understand the impacts on not only the environment, but on communities and other marine sectors. We're conducting our assessments in parallel to the policy development. This is deliberate. It's so that we can update the plan in response to the findings of those assessments, and that we can build in mitigation measures from any negative impacts directly into the plan. We're trialling a natural capital approach to our strategic environmental assessment, and we're also conducting a series of other statutory assessments for Scotland, including our Islands Community Impact Assessment, which will be using information from the SEIA, but we'll also be going out to speak to local island communities so that we can understand how the impacts of the plan might be felt differently on islands. So we've developed a series of national level objectives for the plan over 7 key themes, and thank you to everyone that came up to Edinburgh in June to help us develop those themes for the plan. These new draft national level objectives reflect the national level of ambition for marine planning in Scotland, and they will support our blue economy outcomes. Now, these objectives were developed by a huge mapping exercise of all the Scottish Government and UK Government and international commitments, and an evaluation of what planning could do to help support deliver on those commitments. So it was built up from the outcomes. So we're going to be responding to the twin crises on climate and biodiversity loss, and we have objectives on climate change mitigation and adaptation, ecosystem health and protection, and enhancement. To support our marine economies, we have 3 objectives on sustainable development, including opportunities for coexistence, safeguarding marine sectors, and aiming to reduce the conflict for space. We've included a Pacific objective to recognise the importance of the marine economy to our islands and coastal communities, and acknowledging the benefit that we all get from the sea and the coast, an objective supporting social well-being through inclusion and accessibility, and a 6th objective looking at the value of our cultural heritage along the coast and the marine environment. So new for NMP2, everyone loves a plan. We are actually including a new theme on implementation. So we're not just writing a plan, we're writing the actions that go with the plan. And this allows us to include objectives on how the plan should be used in future, and our monitoring and evaluation framework. So we're committed to our vision that we set out in our statement of public participation, that everyone who uses, relies on, or has an interest in Scotland seas has the opportunity to take part in the decisions that affect them. We've developed our public forum and our steering group, and we've been using strategic partnerships to help us reach other groups of people, including young people and coastal communities. We are going to be sharing outputs as they come for this National Marine Plan. We're not waiting for the draft plan and the draft consultation. You will be seeing, hopefully, much more of us and more information come out of the plan as we go through it. We really want to design this plan with stakeholders. We want to co-design the policies underneath the plan. So we're trying to build that into the whole process before we get to the draft plan consultation. So that takes me lastly to what have we done and what's next. We've published our statement engagement strategy. We've completed a strategic appraisal of the current plan so we can learn from it and learn what needs updating, what we should keep. We've started our assessments, and this included a public consultation on the scope of our strategic environmental assessment, and we've started the development of the plan, including the draft high-level objectives. So what's next? Well, over the next few months, we're planning a huge programme of engagement to go out and speak to everyone about these high-level objectives and the policy and help with the policies underneath it. So, If you would like to be involved in those discussions, and please do, please contact us. We've got a mailing list, and we'll be going out, sending out the invites to those events over the next couple of months. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. If I could ask all the speakers to come up and take a seat, that would be great. We've got 25 minutes for a panel debate. And just for the, the fourth or fifth time today, if you go to Slido, we'll be taking questions on Slido.
Oh, yes.
We'll be taking questions from the
please.
room
Like desperate
and
for
from the
one.
balcony. But before we do, I'm going to ask all of the panel members the exam question, I guess, of what approaches to decision making are needed to balance the need for social and economic benefit alongside environmental recovery. So Michelle, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. If we could quiet down, please, so we can hear people. Thank you. Michelle.
Great, thank you. So I think it would be a bit remiss of me to talk about the whole of seabed approach and not say that I think we need a whole of seabed approach to kind of making sure decision-making balances the need for social and economic benefit alongside environmental recovery. But I think really breaking that down, what I'm saying is we need an evidence-based approach. So we need to understand what the demands are for all of the different activities, the sectors within the marine space. We need to think about how that then plays out potentially over the next 30 years or so, and what that might look like. Talking to some of the scenarios that we've been running, but also I think a really important element of that is understanding, I know it's an emerging area really in terms of data, but how does the social value data translate offshore? So obviously I think there's a bit of a geographic disconnect between coastal communities and what's happening so far offshore, that actually we need to really understand the translation of that onshore social value data as to what that means in terms of activity offshore and vice versa. So I think, data for me.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Benj.
Thanks. I would absolutely echo some of the points you made around the whole sort of system plan. I did sneak my 7 points into my talk, so I'm just going to pick out the headlines of my headlines. Collaboration, I think it's a much overused word, but we're not going to make progress if we don't find ways to have a common goal. We have different views on how we get there, but we've got to figure out together how to get there and not get bogged down with our differences. I'm not saying we shouldn't have differences, that's healthy, but we've got to work through them to find solutions, because this is there is an urgent need for my second thing, which is action. And then I think it's just down to engagement and evidence for me. Engagement, and that means a way wider cross-section of society than, of course, we've got here today. It means engaging with communities, with wider society, and its representatives, but also inevitably evidence, not just environmental evidence, by the way, but also social impact evidence, which we haven't really talked about.
Yeah, thanks, Benji. Your point in collaboration is, I've seen so much change in the last 5 years of academics, NGOs, developers, government community all working closely together, much more than they ever have. So, yeah, but thanks, that's really good. Geraint.
I'd slightly add to that, really, is that there's a clarity from the major ports in terms of their decision-making themselves, in terms of what their customer requirements, and they're trying to think ahead about future-proofing, capturing the latest technologies. But I do think but that's quite a small part of the overall decision-making process, and that's where I think, if I call it government more generally, there are often different views on the social economic benefits and the environmental benefit that needs to come through, and I'm not sure that always becomes through at the right time, and I think that the ports can support in that way. But I do think there's a need to, and again, without repeating what I said in the presentation, you don't get any social economic benefit if the plans don't happen or the plans are aborted. Yeah. So I just think there's that need for everyone to sort of think, if everyone's thinking on that basis, then I think we'll end up with good outcomes.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Alyx.
Won't surprise you to hear I'm going to challenge a couple of parts of the question. So first of all, the dichotomy it sets up between social and economic benefit and environmental recovery. And Ben, you talked about this a bit with trade-offs in your presentation. Without nature, there are no social or economic benefits. And we need to be really clear about that. I think, secondly, and this is something my colleague Hugo said in the last session when he was chairing, is environmental recovery. I think we should also be thinking about environmental protection. We don't need to always get to the point where the environment has been devastated or destroyed. We need to also think about being proactive in protecting it in the first place. But in terms of actually answering the question on decision making, we've talked a lot about collaboration just here briefly, and I completely agree. But I'd also like to see that extended within government. We've got a lot of excellent agencies here, DEFRA-linked agencies. What about the other departments in government that should be playing a role in these discussions? We should be talking to business and trade. We should be talking to the Treasury. We should be talking to the Levelling Up team. We should be talking to DESNES. They should all be working on these issues with DEFRA, with all the partners in this room. And I would love to see at next year's Coastal Futures at least a couple of those departments represented and fully engaged in the decision-making processes around these issues.
It's a really good point, and I talked a bit about the international work that we do. We talk a lot about a whole-of-government approach. Michelle talked about a whole-seabed approach, and that's really important, yeah. Annabelle.
Thank you. So just to follow on from that, it's clear from the whole conference so far that this is a very complicated world, the marine environment, and clearly no single body, government, organisation can take a decision in isolation. It's always going to have to be collective in order to be effective. Thank you.
No problem, thank you. Eloise?
So I think I said in the presentation, I think it does involve us all thinking differently, thinking holistically about the environment, economy and society altogether, thinking collaboratively. But I'd also add that all sectors have got an opportunity and the ability to contribute in this space, to contribute towards growing our natural capital, to contribute towards restoring the environment and action on climate change. And actually the solutions, and I think Benji's presentation illustrated that, will come from the sectors, and we need to be inclusive in this discussion with the sectors as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, we've got about 20 minutes left, I think, so I know it's nearing the end of the day, but do we have any questions in the room? Yes, one there. Wait a moment while we get the mic. The chap in the check shirt.
Check. Hello, my name is Marcel, and I'm an MSc student from Newcastle University, and I'm from Indonesia. Well, all day I heard about UK is moving to sustainable energy, and I heard too about the British Petroleum, that movement from gas to the wind farm. Well, my question is if British Petroleum, that had a main site of liquid natural gas in West Papua, Indonesia, has stopped the gas production, what will UK do about the ex-mining land? Thank you.
So I missed the end of your question then,
Sorry. My question is, if the British Petroleum or BP that had main site of liquid natural gas in West Papua, Indonesia, has stopped the gas production and movement to the wind farm, what will the UK government do about the ex-mining land?
The ex-mining land in Papua?
Yeah, in the liquid natural gas site. Thank you.
Wow, that's... okay, I'm going to see if anyone wants to answer that. But there's a really important question there about global trade and just transitions. That's an interesting one, and I don't know. I'm going to ask either Benj or Alyx.
No, I'm afraid I have no knowledge, Marcel, of that specific point, but hopefully there's someone in the room who might be able to answer afterwards.
This is why we need business and trade here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're making a point that actually the energy transition is really complicated, and it's not just about our coastal communities here, it's about communities all over the world, and it's all interlinked. So, yes, thank you. I'll go to Charles quickly.
Charles Clover, Blue Marine Foundation. Question for Benj, really. I mean, I'm just recently out on the Dogger Bank. I'm a huge supporter of wind farm energy, but it daunted even me seeing the amount going in. And are you confident that the compensation, obviously this is having some impact, not a great impact, but it's having an impact. Are you confident that the compensation regime that we currently have is actually working towards this target you've got of net gain by 2030? Is it actually, I mean, kittiwake nests in Newcastle aren't actually putting back what there was on the Dogger Bank. And I wonder if it's helping you, because we've had very good discussions before about...
Yeah, Charles, it's a really good question. I could talk for about 2 hours on this. I will try to be brief. Firstly, actually Dogger Bank isn't one of our projects, but we are compensating for impacts on kittiwake community populations through our artificial nesting structures. And we're in the early days of compensation. Of course, the regulations are quite clear on the need for taking adaptive management measures if it turns out after the fall breeding seasons that we're not seeing the hotels getting occupied. But I think there's a wider point here, and this is there's lots of interesting questions in the is it called a chat in Slido? I don't know, in Slido anyway, about how do we manage to tackle, I'm paraphrasing, tackle climate change and do the right thing with the environment. And I think compensation, environmental compensation, which by the way is not taking us to net positive, is just getting us to net zero in terms of environmental impact. We're going beyond that with the things that we're doing. We're saying, of course we compensate, it's a legal requirement, and be wary of anyone who flags their credentials at how good they are at doing compensation because they're only obeying the law. We need to go beyond that, and that's what we're doing. But I think we need a much more strategic approach to this. There was a question around should we build in MPAs. I'll let the Crown Estate answer that one. But we have some difficult choices to make. When I talk about win-win, I'm talking about where we build, we can also have positive environmental impacts that more than overcome the impacts that we have through development. But compensation, yeah, it's very complicated. It's in its early days. I think we've got to get a lot smarter. The DEFRA-led KAUSK program that some will know is making inroads there, but it's heavy going, and that's because it's complicated, and it's the mother of all stakeholder groups.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to take a question from the balcony, and then we'll go to Slido. Is there any? I can't really see anything up there. Anyone up there?
It's bright.
I'm too busy clinging on.
No, I'm going to say no because I can't see anything. We'll go to Slido. Hannah.
This is a question for Geraint. Growth of ports will coincide with some of our best and most protected sites for nature. What strategic approach is the sector taking to address this?
It's an interesting point because, and I can't speak on specific facilities unless someone asks about a specific site, but it is absolutely consideration in the earliest planning from the major ports group. They're assessing sites on a weekly basis in terms of future growth and in terms of the sites they currently hold. So I would like to think that there's a very early and thorough assessment of how of any potential impact going forward. And as I touched on in my slides, that although is globally owned in many ways, the local point is the absolute critical point in taking communities with us. So the stakeholder efforts are significant, and I would like to think enhanced in the last couple of years since COVID as well. So I think there's a recognition there, but if someone has a question on a specific site, I can certainly go back to them.
Great, thank you. And anything else from the floor? Yes, there's one there.
Hello, thank you. Elizabeth Mitchell, Natural England. I just wanted to go back to Marcel's question because I thought it was a really interesting one and it brought up some really important points for the British seabed. And just thinking about the little I know about West Papua and mining there, I know that it's a place where there have been huge problems with international companies and ex-colonial powers going in and doing major mining operations which displace local populations, and it's part of internal colonialization within Indonesia as well, where you have Java exploiting sort of outlying islands. And now, as you're saying, you've got a problem with infrastructure being left behind, areas being left without proper transition plans. And I'm wondering whether the question that it brings up for us today here in this room is whether, obviously, there might not be as much community displacement in English and British waters, but do we have proper plans across industry, across government, across NGOs, I guess for everyone down here, for what happens in the, like, what happens when a wind farm is decommissioned, what happens when different offshore industries and installations leave behind infrastructure.
Yeah, okay. Just because they haven't really spoken very much, I'm going to go to Louise and Michelle for that question, and I think Benj might have something to say on that as well. I don't know if you can talk a bit about the sectoral plan for energy and how that's linking in and
Yes.
life cycle of stuff in there. Decommissioning, yeah.
Yes, so we have a sectoral plan for offshore wind in Scotland, which is looking, it's to support the leasing, and then we have a licensing regime which looks at the decommissioning and the requirement to consider that right at the beginning for the design of the project. We also have our energy strategy and just transition plan in Scotland, which was out for consultation in the autumn. So we really are trying to consider the impact and the effect of this transition to local people, to other sectors that are affected by it, and building that in. And in the National Marine Plan, the reason we want to go out and speak to people as we design the plan is to support this commitment to just transition so that we can understand the impacts as we go along and we can try to mitigate that as far as possible.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, just on the kind of evidence side and whole of seabed and what we're doing there, we're looking to integrate decommissioning into the spatial models that we're running. At the moment, we haven't done that. That's going to be coming to a future phase, but it's really about understanding what that then starts to look like when you start to take into consideration decommissioning of oil and gas activities, offshore wind, cables that start to become out of service. What can that then potentially create as an opportunity, and how does that look when you start to build out to 2050, when you start to build in that decommissioning aspect? How does that change the picture? So that's something that we're doing. We're building the evidence around that to make sure that we can have that more holistic understanding of what decommissioning opportunities, what opportunities we can gain from those decommissioning activities in future.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And Geraint, you wanted to say something?
It's a really interesting area, a fascinating area. It's a great question because the question we should all ask ourselves really is: we seek to decarbonise the economy or deindustrialise? I think there's a bigger question there for another day. But and in decommissioning and putting sites back to how they should be after they've come to their commercial use or whatever it may be, is it the role of the state? Is it the role of the taxpayer to pay for that, or should it be the private sector playing that part? So I think there's a really interesting area, and whoever does it, what we're all keen to do is not leave any scars or not leave any damage to the environment, or certainly to reinstate what was there. So it's a really important area, and I feel an area that doesn't get enough attention because everyone gets very excited about the big projects coming. But these do have commercial lives, and then what happens after the communities? And you touched on it earlier, I touched on it. Look at Port Talbot's a great example, so we should all follow that to see what happens to that land and whose job it is to put it right.
Great, thanks, Geraint. We'll take another question from Slido.
This is a question for Michelle. They write, I don't think you mentioned fisheries in your list of sectors that are part of your whole seabed analysis. Is that right? If not, why not?
No, that's not right. I hope it was on the slide. Perhaps it wasn't. But yes, fisheries, absolutely. It's not a Crown Estate sector, but there are a number of sectors that aren't Crown Estate sectors which we need to have consideration of within the whole of seabed analysis. So it's when I spoke to the fact that we're in phase 2 at the moment where we're looking at 10 Crown Estate sectors. Future phases of the work will start to build in other sectors, including fisheries, oil and gas, commercial, shipping, those sorts of activities, so that we can have an understanding of the demand out to 2050 for those sectors as well. So we are having that holistic view of the seabed. But obviously it's a phased approach. So yes, it would consider.
Great, thank you. Any more questions from the floor here? I'm going to go at the top of the stairs. In a jacket, sorry.
Hi guys, afternoon. Rohan Smith, Natural England. So I've got a compact question for both Benj and Geraint, okay? So you mentioned transformation or transition, and you also mentioned plan to action. So the offshore wind has supported lots of investigation for offshore integrated mariculture, which is almost a nature-based solution if you leave it in store. So what are you guys doing to move from plans, which you have done the investigation, to actually investing into a real active life offshore, seaweed, shellfish activity? And then for Geraint, what's the Port Authority doing to actually put facilities onshore to facilitate those offshore activities so you can actually get that transition from what's happening at the offshore points or at sea to actually bring it onshore for processing? If you take examples from like New Zealand, where they invest significantly into port facilities for offshore, for onshore facilities for port activities for the offshore activities for shellfish and also seaweed mariculture. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So that's a question about transformation and transitioning, I think, and a lot of what you were saying. If you could, you talked a lot about some of the actions that you were putting in place, but
yeah, I was also going to. So if I understood you right, you were talking about co-use and mariculture, and is that right? Yeah. So really interesting area, one that not just Ørsted, but I think most developers are looking at, and it is market dependent on what you can and can't do inside the footprint of a wind farm. I think we're already coexisting with fixed gear fishing. That's been happening very successfully for many years, actually, in the UK. Can't do it in other markets necessarily, but in the UK we have very good relationships and we have a great coexistence and collaboration around that. Other types of mariculture, I've never been a big fan of putting seaweed. We've looked at this, growing seaweed in wind farms, because seaweed provides great ecosystem services for juvenile fauna, which of course is preyed on by birds, and they may not be the types of animal you want to attract into a wind farm. So, I mean, we joke, but in all seriousness, it might not be the best use. I think there are other things we can do. I think coexistence, though, has many other dimensions. It really does come back to understanding the competing pressures and seeing where we can overlap. I mean, another commercial pressure is offshore wind and the storage of carbon under the seabed. That's been very real for us. So there's a lot to sort out here. But I do think we're going to have to find smarter ways to coexist, whether it's for aquaculture or other commercial activities, and coexist with nature. I'm not going to go back to that, but that is the main point, I think.
Thanks,
about
Benj. And Geraint, you talked about the work that's needed to support floating offshore wind. I don't know if there's anything you can say about the feeling in the port sector about both the opportunity and being able to support the work that's going on offshore.
Again, it's a great question because, and going back to your point about plans into action, if you think about the port estate, and some ports have the gift of having a bit more space than others, but some ports, some of the major ports are incredibly tight in terms of their footprint. And ultimately, that's the space utilization for a port is the fundamental, in many ways, the fundamental to its operations, both commercially and in terms of attracting and retaining customers. So my point is that I won't go into all of this now, but over the years there have been various moments where port space was required for a policy that then perhaps didn't happen at the pace you'd expect, or perhaps didn't happen in the way it was going to happen. And I'll point to the EU exit process in some of this space as well. So ports are thinking very carefully about this, but I go back to what I said. The reason why we need to have so much clarity on this is because a port will try and utilize its space for as long as it can, with as much clarity as it can, rather than stop, start, and maybe not. And it's absolutely critical. So my simple message is the public sector and all the bodies that are supporting on this to work closely with the ports, because the land usage is absolutely critical to everyone in that space.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one more very quick question. Sorry, I'm just going to go. It was up there first, and he's been waiting. So yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, we hadn't talked. So to the two same. Geraint, you made a comment. You put a phrase up that growth is required for sustainability, which I sort of you back off because normally growth is is one of the damaging factors for sustainability, the constant quest for economic growth. Did you mean you needed enough money to put in systems that would approach sustainability for your operations, so a shorter term thing, rather than looking for a longer term sustainability option? So what did you mean by that, and how does it apply to Benj, perhaps?
Well, I think that the key point is I suppose sustainable. I can't remember what's on the slide, but sustainable growth is the key point. But my view, and I think the view of the major ports, would be that we can only deliver on many of the ambitions we have in the environmental space if we have projects happening, and that's the point. Is we have to have projects happening, otherwise land gets left. We don't necessarily get the improvements that we could have because the state can't do everything. I suppose that's the point I would make, and we can have a big debate about whether growth is right or not, but I do think we can capture the benefits and capture the opportunities that come with economic growth.
I know we've only got no seconds left, so all I would say is, sustainable development is a much misused and rather trite phrase, but I don't believe it's oxymoronic. I do think you can find ways to develop in a way that is genuinely sustainable for environment and societies. A lot of people use it as a glib gloss over what they're actually doing, but it doesn't have to be.
And the alternative, of course, is no growth, and then how do you generate the tax receipts and generate the investment that's needed to invest in some of our technologies? I think there's a balance to be struck, but I'm hoping this stimulates a debate.
Thank you both. Anyone else got anything you want to say on that before we finish? No? Okay. Right. Well, I would just like to say thank you to our great panel for a really interesting discussion.